Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth onto an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'"
Thank you, Helen. Oh, wonderful. Good. Okay, so as we started this morning, Nathan just shared a picture he had of going down to the river and seeing the river had broken its banks and the water had flooded right across the children's playing area. Just keep that image in your minds as we go through this morning. So we started to look over the last few weeks at the Gospel of Mark, and today we come to chapter 2 and verses 13 to 28. As we begin, I want to sketch out something of the big picture, and then we're going to go back in and fill in some of the detail. So back in chapter 1, we saw Jesus announce that the kingdom of God is near. And we saw him demonstrate something of what that looked like through signs such as deliverances and healings and that sort of thing. Now, this would have been unusual, and certainly it would have been exciting for the people that were there, but it wasn't completely unprecedented. Had Jesus stopped there, I think that he would have been widely accepted as an important prophet. See, what he was doing and what he was saying was broadly compatible with the teaching of the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. In fact, in verse 44 of chapter 1, we see that there was provision under the law for instances of miraculous healing. See, what Jesus was doing could have been understood within the framework of the existing covenant. But the Gospel of Mark didn't end at verse 45 of chapter 1. And in chapter 2, Jesus starts to show that what he's about is something much more, something far more challenging and far more uncomfortable. He begins to radically challenge what their understanding of the kingdom of God looks like, to show that he himself cannot simply be contained within their existing understanding of the covenant. See, what Jesus is revealing is not something disconnected from what had gone before, but something far bigger and more wonderful. In particular, he begins to show that he himself is at the center of it all. That everything they understood about the law, about holiness, and about obedience would now have to be reinterpreted through him. So our focus today is on verses 21 and 22. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, and no one puts new wine into old wineskins, but new wine is for fresh wineskins. See, this new work of God, mediated through Jesus, is going to require new structures, a new way of understanding God's covenant. And that is what I want us to explore today. So I'm going to look quite briefly at 4 incidents that Mark records here in chapter 2. And in each incident, we learn something glorious about what we call the new covenant. And these are truths that it's good for us to be reminded of. But at the same time, I want us to recognize that for these moments, for the people listening, would have been deeply controversial and unsettling. See, most of us can accept these truths with relatively little cost. See, at the very least, at a cultural level, the ideas are somewhat familiar to us. For them, accepting them would have involved a radical rethinking of both belief and practice. See, Mark isn't saying that everything that has gone before, the covenant as they understood it, was abolished, but he is showing that it is no longer centered on a system, but on a person. And that is deeply radical. And the truth is, it remains radical for us too, because Jesus is alive, he is present, and he cannot be safely contained. So with these thoughts in mind, let's go back and look at the incidents recorded by Mark in this chapter. So first then, the incident of the lame man on the roof, which Matt spoke to us about last week. Now there are at least 2 ways in which this would have been deeply unsettling, though I suspect that we and they would rank those things in a very different order. But let's start with the roof. It was just wrong, wasn't it, in so many ways. Jesus was preaching, and they were making all this noise. That was just inconsiderate, isn't it? And then there was the destruction of property. And what about health and safety? All those bits of roof falling on people's heads. Let's be honest. We would have been pretty upset if that happened to us. Now, I imagine that this hole in the roof business would have raised eyebrows for them too, but for them, there was something far more disturbing. And that was Jesus' claim that he could forgive the man's sin. See, notice that everyone was in agreement about some things. Sin was still serious. It still caused separation from God. People still needed forgiveness in order to be reconciled to him. But Jesus was speaking to people who had been immersed from birth in the traditions and the law of the Old Testament. Forgiveness of sins was something that only God could do. And he did it through the system of sacrifice in the temple mediated by the priests. See, their whole religious life and understanding was structured around this. And now Jesus is saying, reconciliation to God comes through me. Through me, and through me alone, sin is forgiven. See, the problem of sin hasn't changed, but the solution has. See, we read this story and we think, what right did they have to make a hole in someone else's roof? They were thinking, who is this man that he is overturning our understanding of the law? Who does he think he is, forgiving sins? And I want to suggest that their disturbance, which we will see resurface time and time again through this passage, ran much deeper than ours. Because what was being challenged wasn't just behaviour, but the very framework by which they understood life with God. So we move now to our allocated passage for today. And the first thing we read here is about the calling of Matthew and about Jesus sharing a meal with him and his friends. And we need to understand just how shocking this would have been. See, Matthew was a tax collector, and he would have been considered an outcast by the community. See, he collaborated with the enemy. He was regarded as unholy and corrupt. And yet Jesus, along with his disciples, is now eating with Matthew and with people like him. The scribes and the Pharisees just couldn't get their heads around this. How could a man who did good things, who obeyed the law, who appeared to be holy, make himself unclean by associating so closely with unholy people? Now, it's easy for us, I think, to feel indignant and to write the Pharisees off as being intolerant. But if I'm honest, I speak for myself here, I think that reaction says more about my devalued view of holiness than about their hard-heartedness. See, and I suspect many of us, just don't really think Matthew was that bad. So it's easy for us to think that the Pharisees were overreacting. But at one level, they were right. The Bible is clear. All sin separates us from God. And that's true, whether that sin seems small to us or whether it seems very large. God is holy and pure, and we need to remember that and to share his intolerance of all sin. And part of the function of the law was to make that clear. And one of the ways it did that was to stipulate separation between those things that were holy and clean and those things that weren't, so that the holy things wouldn't become unholy. So Jesus, a holy man, eating with sinners was a problem under the law. And how did Jesus respond to their objection? Well, first I want us to notice what he didn't do. He didn't say that sin no longer matters. He doesn't lower the bar of holiness. See, he openly acknowledges that he is eating with sinners, that the people he is with are sick and they need healing. God is still holy, and he is still calling a people to be holy. What has changed is this. Jesus is not made unholy by association with the unholy. He doesn't need to keep his distance, and he has no intention of doing so. He deliberately places himself in the darkest and most broken places, not because holiness has become irrelevant, but because his holiness has power. Under the old covenant, holiness was largely protected through separation, particularly from ritual uncleanness. When that separation failed, then sacrifices were required to restore it. Jesus is saying something radically different. He is saying that holiness flows outwards rather than needing to be protected. Nothing taints it. And more than that, he has the power to make others holy. Now, we rejoice in that truth, don't we? We are righteous in God's sight because of Jesus' holiness. But for those watching him eat with tax collectors and sinners, this truth just didn't fit. Sin felt too big. And the question was, how could Jesus possibly be bigger? So let's try and feel their tension as we move to the next incident. And this is the one about the question of fasting. See, we read that John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, but Jesus and his disciples weren't. And the question is simple. Why? Now, we aren't told exactly what fast this is, but the fact that these two groups were fasting at the same time suggests that it was a part of the expected part of religious practice at that time. See, fasting was something that God had given to his people because it was helpful. It was a spiritual discipline, and it expressed humility and repentance before a holy God. See, the cost and the physical discomfort help people grasp in a tangible way both the seriousness of sin and of their dependence on God. So although fasting was hard, it was good. It was meaningful. It was a part of an expression of their sincerity and their devotion. And yet, for some reason, Jesus and his disciples weren't joining in. And notice again what Jesus doesn't do. He doesn't say that fasting has suddenly become bad. He doesn't say that we shouldn't fast anymore. What he does do is make something explicit that is deeply unsettling. He says that religious practice now has to be shaped around him. He asks, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? In other words, while I am here, this isn't the time for fasting. See, under the Old Testament law, there were set times and recognized ways to express devotion and obedience to God. But Jesus is now saying that what really matters is relationship with him. he places himself at the center. And again, the huge and the vitally important question arises, how can this be? How can a person reshape the religious practices that God himself had given? How can what Jesus is saying be reconciled with everything they'd been taught throughout their lives? See, for many of those listening, there was just no way of holding these things together. And in the next verses, Jesus effectively says, you're right, you can't. See, looking back over these incidents, Jesus says that none of these can be made to fit. He says that what I am bringing cannot simply be added on. It will not fit into existing forms. New wine needs new wineskins. So let's just pause there for a moment and try and put ourselves back into the narrative. Because I think that if we had been there listening to Jesus at this point, we too would have felt deeply conflicted. See, on the one hand, we would have felt drawn to Jesus. We've seen people delivered from evil spirits. We've seen people healed of all kinds of sickness. We've encountered someone marked by compassion, by love, by power, by authority. Who wouldn't want to get close? Who wouldn't want to know more? Who wouldn't want to follow someone like this? And yet, at the same time, Jesus is challenging so much of what we have held to be non-negotiable, things that we've assumed were fixed and unchanged and settled. And he isn't challenging them in a purely academic sense. He isn't just inviting us to see things from a slightly different angle. He is saying that he himself is the focus. We can't just enjoy what he does. We have to reckon with who he is. We can't simply add him on to existing structures. We have to rework everything around him. So at this point, Mark records Jesus as saying, no one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth onto an old garment, and no one puts new wine into old wineskins, but new wine is for fresh wineskins. Now, we don't get our wine in wineskins anymore, thank goodness. Can you imagine buying a bottle of wine for your evening meal in a goatskin container? I dread to think what it did to the taste. That obviously is beside the point, but the key thing is that as wineskins aged, they became brittle and rigid. And that was fine for old wine, but not for new. Now, last summer, and I know it's hard to remember on a cold February day, but it was hot, and we had an unusually good grape harvest. So in the autumn, at home, we had about 15 gallons of wine fermenting in demijohns in our dining room. And as it did so, we were treated to the gentle plop, plop, plop of air bubbling through the airlocks. As the sugars in the grape juice fermented, they were converted into alcohol and to carbon dioxide gas. And the whole mixture was alive and active, and you could see it swirling and bubbling. Put that into a rigid, sealed container, and it would burst. New wine needs flexibility. It needs space. It needs containers that can expand with it. The old, rigid ones couldn't contain the life and vitality of the new wine. And Jesus is saying, I am the new wine. It is not possible to have me and to leave the old structures unchanged. In fact, I will break them. Not because they were evil, but because they are incapable of holding what I am bringing. See, the people were right to feel uncomfortable. They were right to struggle because reconciling Jesus with the old ways wasn't possible. They would have to let go, not of God, but of the way they had learned to relate to God. See, something living, expanding and demanding was arriving, and holding too tightly to what felt safe would actually result in loss. See, Jesus doesn't dismiss their concerns. He validates them, but he also places a choice before them. Not between old ideas and new ideas, but between preserving what feels secure and following the person standing in front of them. Now, I don't know exactly why Mark structured this chapter as he did. I am sure that it wasn't arbitrary. But it's almost as if, having explained the lens through which those first three incidents must be understood, Mark then records one final test case. If this is all true, he asks, if forgiveness, holiness, and practice are now reshaped around Jesus, if this new wineskin really is required, there is one final question. Is it flexible enough even to reshape the Sabbath itself? And can you deal with that? See, at the end of our passage, we read, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, we read these words far too easily, but we won't understand what Mark is doing in this chapter unless we grasp something of the impact these words would have had on the original hearers. See, of all the commands in the Old Testament, Sabbath observance occupied a uniquely important place. It reaches right back to creation itself. It functioned as a sign of the covenant. And as such, it didn't just regulate behavior, it marked the identity of the people of God. See, deliberate breaking of the Sabbath was treated with huge seriousness. So even when many other failures could be dealt with through sacrifice, breaking the Sabbath could be a capital offence. So Mark isn't recording a minor incident here. Jesus and his disciples weren't just brushing against the edges of the law. Here, Jesus pressing right in at the very centre. See, there's a progression through these incidents. We move from what is controversial to what is unsettling through to this moment, which is covenant redefining. Again, let's note the points of continuity. Jesus isn't abolishing the Sabbath. The Sabbath remains God's good gift. God rested on the seventh day, and Jesus isn't doing away with the principle of a rhythm of rest. The Sabbath rest pointed to dependence and trust in God, and this too wasn't changed. But what has changed is that even the Sabbath had to be reinterpreted through him. Jesus declared that he was the Lord of the Sabbath. The law did not define Jesus, but the law was reshaped around him. And if we sneak a peek into the first few verses of chapter 3, we see that this point was well understood by those that were watching. And at this point, some became implacably opposed to Jesus. They understood that if Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, he was claiming an authority that belonged only to God. And so we read at that point they began to plot his destruction. Right here in chapter 2, the stage is set for the central conflict of the gospel. The first steps on the pathway to the cross have already been taken. See, those that rejected Jesus understood what was at stake. They understood the choice that was before them. And the great tragedy is that so much of what they wanted to hold on to was good, but they couldn't accept Jesus at the centre. And the same choice is before us today and every day. It took me a long time to try and write a conclusion to this message. Not because it's difficult to state, because it isn't, but because it is difficult to apply. See, in this chapter, Mark is clear that Jesus hasn't come to improve our existing way of life, but to become the centre of it. Jesus can't just be added to what we already have. Everything has to be shaped around him. And that leaves us with a real choice. A choice between what feels safe and secure and comfortable and following Jesus in a way that allows his life, his presence, and his way to shape us and to move us. And that can feel scary. And Jesus himself said that it would cost. But what does that look like for you? I can't tell you. I have often prayed, Jesus, be the centre. But I would struggle to tell you exactly how that has been worked out in me. So I'm just going to finish with a few questions drawn from the passage. Not necessary to answer right now, but just things to think about. See, Jesus loved the faith of those that dismantle the roof. But would I have done that? Am I willing to cross boundaries of social acceptability or to do things that just seem frankly unreasonable if Jesus asks me? Are you? Am I willing to get my hands dirty? To get involved with people and situations that make me uncomfortable, believing that through me, Jesus can bring good even into desperate places? Are you? Are there things that I am holding on to, perhaps things that are good in themselves, but that Jesus is saying, let go of? I don't know. What about you? See, we see signs that Jesus is moving across our country and here at Beacon Church, and that is exciting. And I think it's something we all long for, isn't it? We want to see the kingdom of God come. But it won't fit into old wineskins. Not because they're bad, but because something living and expanding needs space. Jesus is gentle and gracious, and we must never forget that. But he also insists that he is Lord, and we mustn't forget that either. I'm going to invite the band to come back up, and we're going to sing the song, Jesus Be the Centre. And let's sing that together as a prayer. A prayer that asks for his fire in our hearts, his wind in our sails, and the courage to go where he leads, trusting that as we centre ourselves on him, he will shape what follows. See, putting Jesus in the centre doesn't mean that everything is going to suddenly become clear and certain, but he does offer himself. And that is enough. Putting Jesus in the centre doesn't mean that everything will become easy, because it won't. But he won't ask for more than we have. Putting Jesus in the centre isn't the safe option. But will we hold out for something that is better than safe?